So today marks the first Sunday in Advent, and I have to admit, I love Advent. I love Advent, and I am sure in a few months I'll remind you that I love Lent. I love both of these times of year because they are so intentional. They are about waiting, which I don't really like waiting, but they're also about preparation. And I like preparation. I like the intentionality of preparation. If we do Advent right, we intentionally seek God. Our worship series for Advent this year is called Heavenly Peace, Doing December Differently. And I hope that that's exactly what we'll try to do this season as we celebrate. During Advent, we purposely wait and we prepare for the arrival of the Emmanuel, of God with us. Advent is not about exuberant joy the way Christmas and Easter are. It's kind of a quiet season. It's a quiet anticipation of what is to come. And we don't know exactly what that is to come, but we wait and we prepare. When what comes gets here, it's in a form that we never would have expected. Advent is a holding place for hope. Advent is a time of quiet anticipation, which is kind of interesting because I think that December is one of the loudest months in the entire year. December is such a noisy time. Everything is loud. Everything is spectacular. We plan and we prepare and we try to make everything festive and perfect. Everything lights up. It flashes and it sparkles. And if we're honest, I think that even at this time of year, we kind of sparkle. We just decorated our Christmas tree this weekend, and so we have ushered in the season where every day, no matter what, we will all be covered in glitter from head to toe. It just seems to grab onto us. We sparkle during this time of year. At the beginning of our passage from Isaiah today, Isaiah is asking God to be loud. Tear open the heavens. Make your arrival spectacular. Be bold, God. We want there to be absolutely no question that God is here and God is with us. God, make your presence known. Isaiah knows that God's done it before. God delivered the Israelites from Egypt during the Exodus in incredibly dramatic ways. Isaiah knows what our mighty God is capable of. Mountains will quake. When God arrives, everyone will take notice. So that begs the question, just like Isaiah, we might find ourselves pondering, where is God now? God's glory and God's might makes this silence a little troubling. And it did for Isaiah too. The people in the post-exilic Israel were wondering, where has God gone? Sometimes in the silence, we wonder, God, where are you? Isaiah is begging God. He wants to feel God's presence. Tear open the heaven. Come in fire. Send an earthquake. Isaiah wants to really feel it. But sometimes, at least from Isaiah's perspective, it seems like God's gone into hiding. Have you ever wondered about that yourself? Isaiah seems to be just a little bit nervous that maybe God has forgotten about them altogether. I think that the lectionary texts for Advent are always so interesting. I mean, it is December, and we are ready to celebrate. We have our eyes on that promise, and we know that the promise will be fulfilled in that tiny child that we will find in a manger on Christmas Eve. We're ready to celebrate. And yet the lectionary texts often call us to pause for a moment. Our passage from Isaiah today is a lament. Why? At this time where we are decking the halls and getting ready to celebrate, why should we lament? During our time of waiting for Christ, our lectionary text has us wondering, where has God gone? Why is God hiding from us? Our passage from Isaiah today is a mix of emotions, and it's all kind of confusing. A God whom Isaiah knows confidently is the Father of us all, the Creator of us all. Why would this God choose to hide his face from his creation? If God is a God of steadfast love, a loving Father, a careful potter crafting each and every one of us with his own hands, why would he hide himself from us? If God is almighty and able to save in dramatic ways, why doesn't God intervene? If God can intervene, and we know that he can because we've all read the dramatic stories, and Isaiah is incredibly familiar with these stories, why isn't God intervening? To set the context a little bit, the Israelites have had their promised land and they have lost it. They've spent years in exile. They've struggled to find their way back, to seek God, to follow God's laws. And they lament and they wonder, where has God gone? Sometimes I think we ask that question too. We can start to wonder, where is God in the face of the natural disasters that we've seen one after another this year? Where is God in the face of disease? Where is God in the face of loss? Where is God in the face of the violence that seems to be everywhere? We read the Bible and we read about God's mighty saving actions and we wonder, where is God? We need God now. Where is God today? The lectionary text seemed to be preparing us for the fact that God does not always arrive at the time and in the form that we would expect. We really want God to get our attention. We want to be able to rush about our lives, flitting from one thing to the next, racing to accomplish every last thing on our growing to-do lists. And then we want God to still be able to get our attention. We find ourselves so distracted, and then we ask, God, where are you? During this jam-packed time of year, we find ourselves feeling empty, longing for meaning. We can lose sight of the whole reason that we're doing this celebrating. We get distracted and we mistakenly place our hope in things. We place our hope in things that are not God, but just things. And you know what I find interesting? This is not new at all. The early Christians didn't celebrate Christmas. In fact, the first calendar evidence we have for the celebration of the birth of Christ is in the year 336. That is 300 years after the followers of Jesus gathered on that first day of the week to remember and to break bread and to celebrate Christ's resurrection. And it's 200 years after we have our first indications that Christians were celebrating an Easter feast every year. The birth of Christ was first celebrated around 336. And then already by the year 400, we're having issues with this. The bishop Asterius of Amasia preached a sermon, a message strongly against the excessiveness of the nativity celebration and gift giving in the year 400. We've had this problem for a while. To paraphrase what he said this: should we call this a feast? It isn't a feast at all. There's no real friendship behind all the presents. Everyone wants to get presents. Those who give them are ill-tempered. Those who receive them pass them on to more prominent people. This so-called festival causes nothing but debts and grief. Children learn to beg and grovel for presents. Those who can, get out of town. Those are some pretty harsh words. But I think some of it we can kind of relate to. I think we often blame the commercialization of Christmas for some of these issues, but is that completely fair? Have you ever wondered if all of this excess at Christmas time is merely reflecting us back to ourselves in an inflated, twice the size kind of way? Does this excess of this season simply magnify the deep consumer focus of our culture? Does it shine a light on the ways that we mistakenly place our hope in the wrong places? With so many of our interactions and our communications that we receive, particularly at this time of year, have the goal of getting us to buy something. And particularly during this season, it can start to get to be too much. We can start to become disgusted by the mass marketing of our hopes, and rightly so. Perhaps this perception of ourselves, this reflection that this excess shines back on us, is a profound gift. God's hiddenness can help us to evaluate our beliefs and our practices, just like it did for Israel. When we open ourselves up to receive God's gift of God's calling with fresh eyes, we can once again understand the wonder of this invitation. God has invited us into relationship. God's hiding from us is possibly divine judgment for the ways that we have placed other things in front of God, but it is also divine mercy. The no's that we get from God can help us to find those meaningful, those profound yeses in life. The divine hiddenness tells us something about the way God has chosen to relate to us and to relate to the world around us. In Isaiah 64, God has hidden himself and has refused to intervene dramatically and powerfully to rescue the Israelites. Now, this really frustrates Isaiah. How do you understand God's absence in light of the stories of God's powerful presence in the ancient stories of God's divine deliverance? Dietrich Bonhoeffer was a Christian theologian, a German, during the time of the Second World War. When he looked at the world around him, the evil that just seemed to be surrounding him, he asked these questions too. Writing from a German concentration camp in 1944, Bonhoeffer dared to draw this logical conclusion. He said this: God would have us know that we must live as men who manage our lives without him. The God who is with us is the God who forsakes us. The God who lets us live in the world without the working hypothesis of God is the God before whom we stand continually. Before God and with God, we live without God. God lets himself be pushed out of the world onto the cross. He is weak and powerless in the world, and that is precisely the way, the only way, in which he is with us and helps us. Through this realization, Bonhoeffer renewed his faith in the God of the cross. Bonhoeffer realized that the God of the cross is powerful in suffering, that he is omnipotent in vulnerability. God is not just hiding himself temporarily by covering up his awesomeness in sort of a Clark Kent Superman kind of a thing. This vulnerability is on purpose. This hiddenness reflects something, a quality of God. An all-powerful God is committed to relating to each and every one of us through vulnerability. Not by forcing us, not by dominating over us in order to gain our allegiance, not by twisting our arms and dragging us along, but through sacrificing service and gentle love. Just because God isn't working in the same dramatic ways, parting the Red Seas of all of our struggles, God's divine power hasn't abandoned us. God is still with us. God hadn't abandoned Israel. We don't have to place our hope in God intervening in the exact same way that God did in those ancient stories of deliverance. God surprises us. God responds to us in ways that we do not expect. The intervention is not going to look the same. But when we place our hope in a God of steadfast love that is the same yesterday and today and tomorrow, a God who hears our cries, a God who knows our pain and will not abandon us, a God that will redeem everything, all that is lost, and make each and every one of us new. Just like Isaiah, we can root our hope in remembering those mighty works of God, but we don't have to expect the same kind of grandeur to know that God is with us. Isaiah seems to be responding to God, or actually, he's reminding God. I think he maybe is more reminding himself, and he can also be reminding us that we are God's beloved creation. O Lord, you are our Father. We are the clay, and you are the potter. We are all the work of your hand. Isaiah pleads with God, please don't be angry with us forever. Please don't leave us in our sin forever. And during Advent, we ask this too. At this time, we do anticipate the arrival of the Christ child. And in this passage from Isaiah, where God is asked to tear open heaven, we can be reminded of the time when the veil was torn. Matthew tells us that at the time of the crucifixion, the veil was torn, and the division between God and humanity that was caused by our sin had opened up. God is with us. God is always with us. God has not abandoned us. God came to us in the flesh as Emmanuel, as the God with us. And we celebrate that, as we celebrate that glorious arrival of the child in Bethlehem, we also anticipate with hope and with faith that God has not abandoned us, that Christ will come again in glory. So this begs us to ask the question, where do we place our hope? How do we keep our hope alive when it seems like God has forgotten us? How do we consciously do December differently this year? What can we do to reduce some of the noise in our lives that makes us feel apart from God? How can we reduce things so that we can make a space for God? Today, as we worship in our lovely sanctuary, which is beautifully decorated and so festive, we lament a little bit with Isaiah. And I think that this lament helps us to see things a little more clearly. I think that the bitter informs the sweet. Advent holds in balance God's judgment and God's blessing and God's promise. Recognizing God's presence in our lives and in our world is a daily task. It's something that we have to do over and over and over again. It's a task that becomes all the more difficult when we fill our lives to the brim with busyness and we allow ourselves to get distracted. When we focus on shopping for gifts rather than appreciating the gifts and the blessings that we have been given. But if we are attentive, God is visible in our midst. Isaiah calls for us to wait with hope for God to be visible once again. Isaiah is calling the people of faith to watch and to wait for the Lord with eyes and ears to hear God's calling. As we listen to Isaiah's voice at this time of year, we proclaim that Advent is more than a time to just focus on the promise of God. Advent is a season where we intentionally turn our focus and our hope to the presence of God, who is already and always with us. Let us pray together. God of all creation, you lovingly crafted us and called us your people. Help us to be mindful to feel your presence with us. Help us to slow down during this busy time, to slow down long enough to truly appreciate the ways that you are at work in our lives each and every day. During Advent, during this time of waiting, renew our faith and our hope in you. Amen.